So thanks guys for showing up this morning. We're going to talk about what to do or what to say when you get a lead that inquires for, 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 or more. And this happens all the time. And for those of you that are brand new, this will be great because you probably haven't yet received them, but those of you who have been here for a while, I know you've gotten them, I get them. And we don't want to pass on those opportunities because there's still buyers, there's still people that need final expense insurance, but we have to kind of skillfully bring that out of people to determine whether or not that's like a saleable lead for us, because you also don't want to waste your time. We want you, having multiple conversations and moving on if you can identify if someone really isn't a buyer. So with that said, before I go into what to say, I just want to kind of ask the group, what are you currently saying? How are you currently handling? How do you think you would handle it for those that haven't, gotten a lead that's inquiring for that much coverage yet? And that way we can get an idea of where everybody's at. I know what a lot of you are currently saying, but let's open it up to who wants to start. What do you currently say when someone says, yeah, I'm wanting 150,000 of coverage?
And I'm new, but the first question I might ask is it permanent or is it temporary? Because it's a pretty large amount.
Okay, is it permanent or temporary? Well, who else?
Well, Dana, what I usually do is that I acknowledge what they say, and then I just continue on with the script, and then we'll figure out, if that's true. I just keep it moving, and then when I get to the end and I start giving them quotes on what we can do for them, typically they don't really they don't go back to the 100,000 because they hear the prices of the 10, 15, 20. Then they can see it's not in their price range. So
okay, so we have acknowledged what they say, but just continue on.
Right,
Who else?
right.
I usually say, sorry. I usually say,
Carlos, go ahead.
why do you need such, can you tell me why you need such a large amount of coverage?
Okay, so why do you need such a large amount? Who else?
Yeah, what I probably would say before your training is, how did you arrive at that figure?
Okay. Anyone else?
Pretty much do what Malik said and acknowledge them and kind of head into the script as I'm already doing. And or if they're asking specifically a question like, what do you offer? I say that's a really good question, and I promise I'll revisit that in just a few minutes, and then I keep going pretty much.
Okay. Who else? I haven't heard anyone knock it out of the park yet, which isn't a bad thing. It's great that we're doing this training then. So anyone? One more person?
So
John?
what I believe I would do is, obviously once hearing that, not only I would acknowledge, but then I would also be kind of inquisitive, kind of like, oh, where did you see this offered? Tell me more about kind of,
Bianca, Texas. How can I help you?
just some questions to kind of see the validity of like where does that come from, and then remember it, save it, and then we get to the term and whole life comparison, then kind of use it as ammunition when discussing that more openly with them to determine kind of, is this a realistic approach, and then kind of dive a little deeper at that point.
Okay, good. So just kind of figuring out where, like if they saw an ad for it, and then kind of taking a deeper dive when you get to the term versus whole life explanation. Okay.
Yeah.
So the script is a foundation, right? The script is your foundation for how a lot of your calls will go. It, probably 70% of your calls the script will work every time with 70% of your calls. But it's not going to solve every situation you're going to get. And we do these trainings so that way, once you have the foundation for how to handle a cookie cutter final expense inquiry, then we're going to start adding layers for what to do when you start getting other types of scenarios. And so this would be one that I would say is definitely common, especially if you're taking a lot of leads, if you're licensed in a lot of states and you just have a lot of opportunity, it comes up. So staying true to the script, if someone says, yeah, I'm looking for 150,000, 200,000, always acknowledge, definitely, and not like congratulate, but kind of pump them up. So, oh, that's awesome. That is fantastic. I'm glad you're taking this first step to looking into what options might be available for you. So I always kind of set the tone that way, kind of acknowledge them in a very positive manner, say that's really great that you're exploring what options are available for you. And I will still ask the questions in the script as far as, how long have you been looking? What have you found? Have you ever had life insurance before? What happened to that policy? So I'm still asking all those situational questions because I want to find out where their head's at, how long they've been looking, what they think is out there, so that I can, get into their psyche of their mindset. That's really important. Then I would want to know what they need to use that money for. So instead of Carlos, instead of saying like, how did you arrive at that figure? Or I would never ask, by the way, is that permanent or temporary? Because you have to remember that 95% of the people that we're speaking to have no clue how life insurance works. And the last thing we want to do is make them feel smaller by asking them questions they may not understand or have the answer to. So we always want to come from a position of like a business consultant, but at the same time, almost speak to them like they're 5. And that's not in a condescending way. It's, you have to remember that people don't know anything about life insurance. So we can't ask them questions assuming they know the answer, because that will almost put someone in a defense because they don't know what to say or how to respond. So I would always, come out and say, what expenses do you need that 150,000 to go towards if something did happen to you, and you do pass away? So now I'm going to find out if they just saw, maybe an ad and they're like, oh, I don't know, I just saw something that said, seniors can get 150,000. So that would be like scenario A. And in that case, I would say, oh, okay, so what about that ad attracted you the most? Because now I'm going to hear what they told me, why they inquired. It probably is a high amount of coverage for a low monthly payment, and it's not necessarily, they don't necessarily have an idea of what they would use that money for, what their family would use that money for. So that's kind of one scenario. A more common scenario would be, well, I want to make sure that there's enough money for my family to pay off my house, right? So sort of mortgage protection. That's probably a more common one you would get. And of course, we don't offer mortgage protection, but that's okay. So still come at them very complimentary. Like that's great. That makes a lot of sense, because I'm sure, if something were to happen to you, you would want to make sure your family can continue to make those payments so they don't lose that house, right? Just kind of like re-engage what they've already just told you, make sure you got it. Okay, so now you're like, okay, crap, we don't sell mortgage protection. We still have to find the need. So I always ask, okay, well, that's wonderful. Have you thought about whether or not I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted. So we have someone for Idaho. If anyone's in Idaho, if someone could jump off and grab it. So we have someone that says they want to pay off their house. And I would say, okay, have you thought about like funeral costs or final expenses or anything like that? Or is it just mainly your mortgage? And I would probably say 8 or 9 times out of 10, they will still say, well, yeah, it'll go towards that too. And as long as they say yes, and they acknowledge the fact that they definitely need something for final expenses and funeral costs, then we got them, right? And why do we have them at this point? There's so much now. I have so many questions in my head that I want to make sure that I ask them, and I can now understand the direction I need to go on how to sell them. So once I know that they need it for final expenses and funeral costs, what do we do next? Anyone have any ideas?
Ask a question.
Like what?
So if you did want to, thinking about now your funeral cost, how much do you think you would need towards that?
They don't know the answer to that. That's another type of question. We don't want to ask permanent, temporary. We don't want to ask how much do you need, right? We don't want to ask someone's budget. We don't want to ask because they don't know, right? You have to remember that 99% of people don't know. They don't have a clue. It's our job to educate them and to make recommendations so they look at you as the authority. When we ask questions about how much do you need, how much is your budget, how much do you, is this that, ask them those types of questions, it's going to put them in the defense because they don't know, right? And so you're back to trying to figure out what other type of question you can ask instead. So anyone else have any thoughts? So now that you know that they want a whole lot of coverage and they're open to also hearing about funeral costs, where do you go from here?
You ask them if they want a traditional burial or cremation.
You go exactly. You go right back to the script. So perfect. So now that you're open to that, you go right back to who's going to be in charge of your final arrangements. Do you want a traditional burial or cremation? And you just keep going on and on and on and find the need on that. So now you can segment and separate, and you still ask all the questions that are on your script and you don't deviate. You can even ask additional questions if it happens to come up within the conversation. So that's the easy part. So you have to make sure that you segment what expenses that they need this money for, acknowledge and congratulate them on starting this journey and exploring their options, and understanding that if they do want it for final expenses, that is your opportunity to proceed. If they don't care about it, if it's not something that is on their radar, then you really can't move forward because you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, trying to talk them into the fact that they need it anyways. And that's really hard to do, right? You can't sell somebody something that they're not open to hearing about. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So,
Question,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it sounds like to me, if I don't hear final expense from this prospect, then I shouldn't move forward, more or less. Is that after going through everything that you just shared with us? If I don't hear final expense, does that practically terminate the call?
Possibly, because you have to ask the right questions though. Right. So it's not like I don't wait for them to voluntarily tell me. I have to ask them the questions. So if I ask them what expenses would your family be liable for paying if something did happen and you did pass away, and they're listing all of these things, well, I need to pay off debt, I have to pay off my house, I have to pay off my car, which sometimes we get that. I have to pay off this and that, and I don't hear anything about funeral costs, then I'm going to say, okay, well, all that's fantastic. That's really great that you want to make sure all that is covered. Have you thought about funeral costs, final expenses, paying, the expenses your family will have to pay for funeral costs? And sometimes people will say, oh, I already have that paid for. Sometimes people will say, things that will make you, I don't know where to go from here, right? Because if someone has no desire for that and they're not concerned about that at all, then that's going to be a very, very, very difficult sale. So at that point, if they say, I'm not interested in that, I don't really care about my funeral expenses, you would then kind of pause and say, okay, so the company you're talking to, we represent Lincoln Heritage Life Insurance Company, and the type of insurance we offer is designed to pay for funeral costs and final expenses when someone passes away. And it doesn't sound like that's something you're looking for. Is that correct? And they would say, yeah, I'm not interested in that at all. You would say, fantastic. I hope you find what you're looking for. We're not the company for you. And you guys have to understand that that's okay, right? You can't sell everyone. And the last thing you want to do is try to keep someone on the phone for 30 minutes that isn't a buyer. Because now there's other leads that are coming in, there's other transfers that are coming in, and you're not getting them because you're on the phone with someone trying to talk them into final expense insurance, right?
Yeah, I hear that. I know that on your last call, one of your last calls that you had us listen to, you actually flipped the client from, oh, do you know why do you want temporary insurance? I think that was they wanted a high coverage too, and you flipped them. I remember that. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Before I did that, I asked her, because that is on YouTube. Just the first 7 minutes is on YouTube, but the whole call I sent to you guys. I asked her, about the expenses she was looking to cover. And so I had to figure that out. And she told me how much coverage she got. And then I act surprised. I said, oh, because she had already bought insurance, right? She had said she already bought. And so I was trying to overcome that objection of I already purchased insurance. So I said, oh, okay, well, just so I can close out your inquiry and make sure you don't get any more calls, how can you share with me how much coverage you got? And she had said, well, I got 200,000. And I said, oh, okay. So you were looking for temporary insurance. Okay. And she said, what do you mean by that? And that kind of opened up the window for me to explain the difference and how final expense wouldn't work for that. So that was just me overcoming like an objection in the first 15 seconds of that call. This is someone who doesn't have insurance, and we're trying to figure out if there's a need there for what we offer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I see where you're going. You want us to basically vet them quicker and move on instead of trying to convince somebody, right?
Yeah. I mean, because you want to make sure that you maximize your time. There's only so many hours in the day. And at the same time, I don't want you to misinterpret this with, being lazy on calls, not saying you would, and not still trying to explore whether or not someone sees the need for final expense insurance. It's just trying to teach you how to think outside of the box. And not every person that's inquiring about life insurance wants final expense covered. So Andrew hit it on the head as far as you really have to spend the majority of your time, once you've identified that they still want coverage for final expense, you have to spend the majority of your time in the term versus whole life, like the majority of your time. And you have to get them to acknowledge during that conversation that they need two policies. So what I would do after I did my recap, acknowledge what they are looking for, why it's important to them, insert my feeling words, do all of that, make sure that they understand I know exactly where they're at and how to help them. I will, say who we are, what we do, and then boom. Okay, so we have to talk about something super important at this point, because there's two basic types of life insurance policies you can get, which is essentially term and whole life. Now, do you understand the difference between the two? And sometimes they say yes, majority of times they say no. And when they do say yes, and you ask them, perfect, what's your understanding on the difference between the two? How many people on this call, when they respond, they actually pretty much have no idea?
Yeah, they'll get like
Yeah,
one
I had a call
snippet,
like that.
right?
99%.
Yeah, they don't know anyways, or they might get one tiny little piece of it correct. So don't ever assume, for my new people, that just because someone says, oh yeah, I know the difference, they don't. So we always want to say that's awesome, just so I can make sure we're on the same page here. What's your understanding on the difference between the two? And even when they give you answers, you still want to move forward and say, well, here's my understanding. You got most of it right, but there's still a couple things that I want to make sure you understand. Because this is an important decision, right? You want to make sure that when you do decide which company to get your insurance policy through, when you do decide to make this decision, you want to make sure that you make the right one, right? And you always position yourself as, I always make it seem like you're not buying from me today. Like whenever you do decide to make that decision, you want to make sure it's the right one. So I'm trying everything I possibly can throughout my conversation with someone to have no sales pressure. No sales pressure. I'm just coming from a position of educating someone. Okay, so let's talk about term. And I say it pretty much verbatim, except for one part. Can anyone guess what part that is? In the term paragraph?
I'm sorry, what was the question? I didn't hear you.
That's okay. So when I'm explaining to someone what term insurance is on a prospect that wants 100,000 or more, I read the script verbatim, except for one part. And this part requires a lot more explanation.
I think it's the part where they're talking about the $20,000 worth of coverage for $9.99 from like AARP, Globe Life, because they've already expressed that they're looking for, X amount of dollars worth of coverage, and sometimes they may have even mentioned the company that they came across. So
how would you say that instead? Was that Terrance?
Yeah, that was me. So I would say.
So how would you say that instead?
I would say, okay, Damon, so you've probably come across, online, ads or even things in the mail from, companies such as XYZ that gives, like how you mentioned in the beginning of our call, that gives, $250,000 worth of coverage for a small dollar amount worth of payment, right? Like $9.90, something along those lines. I botched that one, but
that's okay. But you're on the right track, right? I'm going to give you something better to say. Does anyone else want to try?
Well, I know that you add in like you'll say 20,000 for $9.95 or 50,000 for $39.95 or whatever the number is, but you give that higher number that they were initially asking for, so they can kind of see the example, what you're trying to give them. Like, this is what you're going to be offered, but is this really what you want in a policy?
Right. So April, that you learned that from your one-on-one last week.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I still start at the 20,000. Mm-hmm. So I'll say you probably see, advertisements online or in the mail that'll show coverage amounts, of 20,000 for $9.95 a month, or maybe 50,000 for $39, or 100,000 for maybe 85 to 100, even 250,000 for maybe $100 a month or 100. Like, do you see anything like that? Have you gotten any quotes? And I might already know the quotes they've gotten because I've asked them the questions in the discovery phase, right? How long have you been looking? What have you found? I haven't found much. What do you mean by that? You haven't gotten any quotes? Like, it's really important that I really discover where they're at in their search process in the beginning, so that when I get to this part, I'm armed with a lot of information. So you already shared with me that, I'll say you've probably seen this. In fact, you actually shared with me earlier that you had already gotten a quote for your 150,000 for like $99. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Okay, perfect. So this is a perfect example of companies who are advertising these temporary life insurance policies, because the only affordable type of insurance at this age, because most of these people are going to be in their, early 60s possibly, or older, the only type of affordable insurance at this point for that much coverage is going to be temporary life insurance, which means it's probably going to last for about 10 years or so, and then it's going to cancel. Now, you have to be very careful here, because you don't want to make it seem like it's a bad thing to do, because there's nothing wrong with mortgage protection. If something were to happen to them in the 10 years they've had this policy, they definitely want to make sure they have a large amount of coverage so their family can continue to make those payments. So you want to follow that up with, now there's nothing wrong with that, right? It makes a lot of sense for you to explore policies of that size, just in case something were to happen to you and you want to make sure your family covers the mortgage. But what happens then? Walk me through what happens when you outlive that policy and now there's nothing left to pay for your funeral. What happens then? So you have to ask questions like that to get them to think about, oh crap, I don't know what happens then. And we have Texas and Florida, by the way, if anyone's available or if someone wants to go to grab a lead. You have to get them to think about, okay, so you ask them those questions, they're not going to know the answer. So they're going to say, well, I don't know. What do you recommend? Right? When you start educating them in a way where they are leaning into you because the information you're giving them is very valuable to them in their situation, and you don't sound like you're selling them because you're not at this point. You're educating them so that way when you do start talking about who we are and what we do, they're going to be right there with you the whole time. So then you would say, okay, perfect. So that would be what we call whole life insurance. And whole life lasts forever. It lasts your whole life. Now, these policies don't give you as much coverage as a mortgage protection policy would. It gives you much smaller amount of coverage because the policies are they're more expensive because they never cancel, right? They're guaranteed to pay out to your family. There's a reason why $100,000 policy is only going to be, $60, $70 a month, because the insurance company is banking on the fact that you're going to outlive it. And when you outlive it, what happens? Right? This is how I'm engaging them. What happens if you outlive it? What happens to all that money? They'll either say, I don't know what happens, or they'll tell you, I guess they keep it. Yes, all that money stays with the insurance company and you don't have anything anymore. So you were basically renting, which again, it's not a bad thing, because if something were to happen to you in those 10 years, you have that house covered. So the point of me educating you on this is that I need you to understand that you need two policies. You need a policy that takes care of your house, and you need a smaller policy that takes care of your final expenses. And that's going to be much smaller, and it's going to last forever. The price will never go up, the coverage will never go down, and it can never be canceled at any age. Does that make sense? Do you agree that this is the direction we should be going? Yes, it depends on the price. Perfect. We're going to be talking about all that. Now, one thing I need you to understand is that the company we represent, Lincoln, we only provide the final expense coverage. So I will be able to help you with that every step of the way. And then we can look for, I can give you some recommendations on companies that you can call that can help you with your mortgage protection. And I might say something like a State Farm or a Farmers or something like that. They can't come anywhere close to us when it comes to the final expense coverage. They're way more expensive and they can't even offer as much. So I might, list some big companies like that later. So the point is, you cannot leave your discovery phase until you have gotten them to acknowledge that they need something for funeral expenses. You cannot leave the term versus whole life stage until you've gotten them to acknowledge that they need two policies and that they are open to moving forward with you, hearing about your final expense coverage. Now, before I go on, does that all make sense to everyone, or does anybody have any questions?
That makes sense.
Makes total sense, but I have a question about,
I have a question too.
somebody says, well, yeah, but my budget is this, $60 a month max. I don't want two policies. I only want one. Are you going to cover that? Or what would you say at that point?
We're going to cover some of that at the end, but they're not going to tell you that right now, right? You're fast forwarding to the end when you give them quotes. right? So they're not going to tell you at this point, well, my budget is only $60, right? That's not going to happen.
Okay. All right.
Who else has a question?
So Dana, Adele, if somebody posed that to me and I realize that their level of understanding the insurance industry as a whole is, of a 5-year-old, I would just tell them that's a great question. And I'll get to that in a moment. I would move past that because for a term policy, for one, the underwriting is way stricter and they go back 10 years. Most people at 60 years old have been on something or had something in their lives that would disqualify them for a term policy anyways.
But that doesn't matter. No, I'm going to stop you for a second. That doesn't matter. Now you're going to be talking way over their head.
Right.
Right. If you bring any of that stuff up.
I wouldn't.
Okay. But if you don't acknowledge it, if you don't acknowledge everything that I'm saying and you just kind of move on and you don't get them to like agree, like it doesn't matter to me about the underwriting and that whether or not they can get it. At that point, it doesn't matter. I
wouldn't say that to them. I would just say that's a great question, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then once I got to quoting them, I would say, here's how we're going to completely protect you. You're going to have a whole life policy that you aren't going to outlive, and then we can add your accidental death benefits, and they go up to here on
okay,
your
but
policy.
Pause. Yeah, we're going to talk about the accidental in a second on how we loop that back in for this.
That's what I would do. I would loop it back in. That's how I wouldn't.
No, I will. I'm going to tell you how I'm going to do it. But if you still have to explain to them that the policies for that much coverage are a term, because when you get to the pricing, if you don't, they're going to want a price shop. Because if you haven't educated them on the fact that the only way they can get that much coverage for the price they're looking for is temporary, then they're going to think they can get that much coverage for that price permanent. And now you're only offering them 20,000 at the same price that they're looking for. So it's incredibly important that you don't skip that, or the chances of you closing that deal will be much less.
Okay, because I would think that if the person thought that they were going to get a term policy at 60 years old for $20 a month, and if I didn't hone in on that so much, I could still do discovery. Once I got to the quoting, I could say, okay, so they said $20 a month. Well, let's say it was $12. You're going to get this. That stays with you forever. And you're going to have a whole life policy that's going to stay with you forever. So you are completely covered now for the rest of your life.
Well, you're at the end though. You're already at the end, which we're going towards. We're segmenting the parts of the script because you can't skip things and just rely on the close, because there's going to be too many gaps and holes. You have to make sure that you address everything throughout and you overcome concerns and objections before you get them, because we don't want to just stay in features and benefits and how great we are at the end. That actually causes sales resistance. And a lot of people go like this. Like they don't want to be bullied into something, and not that you're doing it in a mean way, but it's like, sometimes it's too much and they have to buy into the whole process, the whole step of the way. So I'm going to get to the accidental part because it's not relevant for every customer as far as how we're going to interweave that. So,
okay, because most term policies can be written to only 55 years old. So anybody over 55, they're not going to get a term anyways. Those are all accidental death policies.
That's not true. That's not true. I've talked to multiple carriers that will offer term insurance after the age of 60, 100%. Yes. So we cannot be that black and white about it. We have to make sure that we're open to what else might be out there. Right. Okay. So let's move on to now we're going to explain to them how the Guardian Society works, the immediate payout, all of that. They're going to love that. Hopefully you're doing it in a way where they're buying into you. So now we're going to ask them the health questions. Now, if somebody is in great health and their final expense, and you're going to explain to them what final expense means and the features and benefits that come with having a final expense policy. What I do, especially if somebody is wanting a policy for mortgage and they're healthy, I will change the script a little bit and present it with 8 units. So I will, instead of 25,000, it's 40,000. Instead of 50,000 for a car accident, it's 80,000. And any sort of common carrier, instead of 100 is 160,000. 160,000 for acts of war and terrorism. So I multiply that to 8 units. And then before I leave that section, you know, you're really healthy, you know, Mrs. Smith. It seems to me that the chances of you passing away in the next 10 years from your health is probably pretty low. In fact, if you were to pass away in the next 10 years, it's probably going to be from an accident, don't you think? And let them say, well, I guess so, maybe. I mean, but anything can happen. Of course, anything can happen, but you're barely taking any prescription medications. You sound really healthy to me. So if you were to pass away from an accident, look at all this extra coverage your family's now going to get. It's already included with the policy. I mean, to be honest, you might not even need a second policy for mortgage protection because it's only going to last 10 years anyway. I mean, we might even be able to save you $100 a month, so you don't even have to get it. And kind of act as if you just came up with that idea based on their situation. But I knew in the back of my head that I was going to say it like that the entire time, right? And, you know, because at the end of the day, they're trying to protect their family and save money, right? They want the lowest payment possible. So, and this is where people get like an aha moment. So, you know, that's actually not a bad idea. And this is going to last forever. It's never going to cancel. So you don't have to worry about outliving a mortgage protection policy. If you were to pass away in the next 10 years from an accident, they're going to get, you know, a policy for your burial within 24 to 48 hours, and they're going to get all this additional coverage in, you know, to continue to make those mortgage payments until they can figure out what the next steps are. Does that make sense? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that's if someone is perfectly healthy. Does that make sense to everybody? And now you've kind of gotten them off of the bandwagon of needing them to continue to shop for another policy because they can pretty much get everything right here. Anyone have any thoughts or questions about that?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
Try that.
So
that was kind of what happened with that call with that woman you sent the recording to. She had just signed up and she realized, oh, maybe I don't actually need that. And then,
right.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you guys have to remember that people don't know what they want. They don't, they kind of know what they want, but they don't know what they need. Right. And they're relying on us to guide them in the right path that makes the most sense for them and for their budget and for their family. And so we have to do it in a way that we've kind of set up that stage from the very beginning, the entire time that leads up to the end, because now they're going to be more likely to want to go with our recommendations because of how we have discussed the whole process with them the whole time, rather than to just rely about it at the end. Right? Because if we're just in pitch mode and they're not buying into everything we're saying and recommending, it's not going to be as powerful. So what happens if someone comes back modified? What? Go ahead.
Sorry, would you, since you're saying, well, you know what, you're really healthy, you probably won't pass from a health issue. Would you go to 20 pay? Would you recommend that too and say,
not necessarily, because
No.
I mean, it depends how old they are and how much the policy is. Usually, if I'm going to offer 20 pay, I will always give both choices, both final expense and 20 pay, because you have to remember that 20 pay is more expensive, right? And it's a lot easier for someone to come in behind you in a few months from now and say, you're paying this much for this much coverage, they might forget it's a 20 pay, right? They're going to forget a lot of what you guys talked about. And it's very easy for someone to say, hey, I'm going to save you $25 a month to cancel your policy. So that's what I think about. And I want to make sure that they have all the facts and that this is a policy. It's a lower payment, but you pay forever. Here's a payment where you have no more payments after 20 years. And does that make sense for you? Right? For the lady that I was on the phone with in the recording I sent, it made sense for her because her family all lives into her late 90s and even early hundreds. And we were able to see together that a 20-year payment option made the most sense. And that I had to remind her that is a more expensive payment. So if anyone else, comes to you later, you have to remember the type of policy you chose. So that's always how I position it, because everything I do, I'm trying to avoid chargebacks, right? We don't want to do all this work just to have a cancellation or a replacement in a few months. Did that answer your question, Carlos?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So if someone's modified, there's another angle we can use. So they answer, yes to some of the health questions. They're taking a modified medication. You might even find this out early on, because sometimes people will tell you, and sometimes people have health issues or they're unhealthy. A lot of them will tell you that early on. They'll say, I don't even know if I can get approved, or I have diabetes, or, I have this, I have that. So you might kind of get an idea early on, depending on what they say to you. You might not know till the end. So I'm going to give you two scenarios right now. If they tell you early on that they have some sort of health issue they're concerned about, when you go into the term versus whole life paragraph, you're still going to do it the way that we talked about earlier. However, you're going to flip the switch a little bit. So you might see policies advertised online or in the mail that show coverage amounts of $20,000 for $995, $50,000 for $39, $100,000 for this, $200,000 for that, right? You can always estimate that a monthly payment for term insurance is probably about 7 to 10% of the total coverage amount. So I'm not making up those prices. That's typically what I'm seeing. So what I mean by flip the switch is, however, people can only get those policies when they have no health conditions. So you shared with me earlier that you have diabetes and you have some health conditions that you're a little bit concerned about. Those types of policies, people can only get them when they're 100% healthy. So it's possible you may not even qualify for them anyways. Does that make sense? Because someone that's not healthy or is worried about their health, they might think it's probably a really good idea to get only a 10-year policy because they probably won't live that long anyways. So you have to psychologically get them to understand earlier on that, the reason that they're priced the way they are is because they're banking that you outlive it. And with someone with a health condition, they're not going to give you that much coverage for that much money if you're higher risk. Does that make sense? Right. So you're kind of talking about term in a different way at that point, kind of planting the seed that they probably won't get that much coverage anyway. So that's if you find out early on that they have some sort of health condition. Before I move on, does that make sense to anyone, or does anyone have any questions?
No, it makes sense.
Okay. So let's say we don't know they're modified till the end when we ask the health questions. You're still going to do it the same way, but before you talk about the accidental coverage, you're going to say, now I know we talked about how great this mortgage protection policy would be for you to consider earlier. But now that I understand your current situation and your health, I want you to know that it's going to be really, really hard to get approved for a policy like that. You have to have no health conditions, because think about it. The insurance company isn't going to give you a low payment for that much coverage if the chances of you passing away in those 10 years is high. So I want to talk to you about another thing that our policy offers. And then you talk about the accidental, and you do it the same way. If you were to pass away from an accident, but you don't say you're still, the chances of you passing away from an accident instead of your health, you can't say it that way anymore, because now you have someone that's sick, right? That has some health conditions. So you would have to say, now a term policy, it's probably going to have a 2-year waiting period. And if you have accidental death coverage, that's going to go into effect right away, right? If you were to pass away from this, and this, here's how much coverage you would get. And I would still do the 8 units for someone that's really concerned about a large amount of coverage. And you have to get them to buy into the fact that they can no longer do the research to search for a term policy because they cannot get it anymore. They won't be approved. And they have to buy into that. And that the only policy that makes sense is going to be a final expense policy for a smaller amount of coverage with the additional coverage that they're looking for if they pass away from an accident. And that's going to be there for their family forever. Does that make sense, right? I'm always asking, does that make sense? Do you see how the policy you were originally inquiring on may not be the best option anymore because of what we've talked about? Yes, I do. And do you see how this type of policy probably makes more sense because of X, Y, and Z? Yes, I do. Okay, so until you get that agreement and that buy-in, you don't give pricing. Right? They have to be sold on the whole idea of everything you've talked about before you go into the quotes. And once you go into the quotes, now it's just about finding something that fits their budget. So Carlos, when you asked me earlier, I only have a $60 budget. It doesn't matter what their budget is because you've already sold them on the idea of what we're offering before you get to the price. Does that make sense?
It does. And, I've gotten to that point, but sometimes they'll still say, well, it's still not enough. What do you do then? Just let them off the hook, or do you just try and reemphasize it?
Well, you'd have, so just answering that question, is it enough? Because we'd have to hear your call, right? We'd have to see exactly what you did, how you said it. Yeah. Did you miss any steps? Were there still gaps? Did they not really buy into the concept? It's not just about the end. It's about what you said leading up to the end. And I don't know, how that conversation went, but I can tell you, if they really believe you and they really buy into what you're saying, they're going to have to get a policy. And your job is to let them know there is no other option, right? Especially if someone is modified. They're going to be modified anywhere. They're not going to be getting term insurance anywhere. Okay. And if they believe you, if they trust you, they will use you as a guide. Well, what do you recommend I do? So then you get to the end and your job is to give them recommendations based on your conversation, based on their situation. So based on everything we've talked about today, I'm going to start with 3 options that I think are a really good fit for you, based on your budget, based on, what you want for your final wishes. And you just let me know which one sounds the best to you. And if we have to change it, we can. Okay, so I'm just talking to them like a person, right? Like, I understand where you're at. Hopefully one of these makes sense, and I just can. And at that point, if you've done a good enough job, it really is only about finding something that fits their budget. Because what are their other options? In my mind, there are no other options. This is it. So I don't let them off the hook. They're either buying from me or they're not buying at all. Or I've identified early on that burial insurance isn't important to them and I don't waste my time.
Yeah, you're right. The buy-in, I think, got to get that for sure. Thank you.
So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today as far as how to overcome and still move forward with someone who wants a large amount of coverage. You never make the mistake of saying, oh, we only offer 35,000, right? That's like literally shooting yourself in the head before you even have a chance to get started. You don't even acknowledge that. But we'll open it up now to any other questions that anybody has. And I know there's a lot of live transfers coming in, so we want to jump on the phones.